I'll never forget that night. The air was thick, stale, the kind of desert chill that creeps in after the sun's long gone but still lingers just beneath your skin. I was standing alone at a bus stop on the outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona, the street lamp above me flickering like it could barely keep its eyes open. It was nearly midnight, and I was exhausted, the kind of tired that makes your bones feel like they belong to someone else. I'd just missed the last bus, which meant I had to wait at least another 40 minutes for the next one. I should have just called a rideshare. I should have just walked to the nearest gas station. But hindsight's a cruel bastard, isn't it? At first, it was just me and the silence. No cars, no people, just the wind rolling through the empty street, rattling loose gravel and garbage across the cracked pavement. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to shake the gnawing unease crawling up my spine. My phone was at 8%. Not dead, but useless enough that I was already making a mental list of what I'd do if it shut off. Then I saw it. A black SUV, creeping down the street, moving slower than it should have been. Not slow enough to be suspicious, at least, not at first, but just slow enough to make my stomach twist. Maybe it was my own paranoia, maybe it was nothing, but something about the way it rolled toward me, the deliberate nature of it, made my skin crawl. I turned away, pretending to be focused on my phone, but I could still hear it. The low hum of the engine, the quiet weight of its presence as it slowed to a stop just a few feet away from me. The window rolled down. I glanced up, trying to keep my expression neutral, but my gut had already decided what my brain was too polite to acknowledge. This wasn't normal. The driver was a man, late 30s, maybe early 40s. He had the kind of face that looked like it had seen some things, a little too worn for his age, with messy dark hair and a scruff of facial hair that looked more like neglect than a style choice. His jacket was zipped up to his chin, black, blending into the night like he was just another part of the darkness. He smiled at me, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was too wide, too eager, the kind of smile a predator gives a wounded animal before the final pounce. "Hey," he said, his voice smooth, almost too calm. "You waiting for the bus?" I forced a polite nod. "Yeah, just waiting for the next one." He didn't say anything right away, just stared at me, eyes dark and unreadable, the way a snake watches a mouse before it strikes. I shifted my weight, suddenly hyper-aware of how alone I was, how the nearest open store was at least 3 blocks away, how there wasn't a single other soul in sight. "You know," he finally said, tilting his head slightly, "it's pretty late to be standing out here alone. Not exactly safe." Something about the way he said it sent a chill slithering down my spine. It wasn't concern. It wasn't a warning. It was something else, something darker. I forced a tight smile. "I'll be fine. I do this all the time." That should have been the end of it. A normal person would have nodded, maybe wished me a good night and driven off. But he didn't. He just sat there, eyes locked onto mine, unblinking, unreadable. "So where are you headed?" he asked, his tone shifting just slightly, a little more insistent now. "I could give you a ride. It's a lot safer than standing out here." I felt my stomach knot. My first instinct was to be polite, to brush him off without escalating the situation, but every part of me, every nerve, every instinct was screaming at me to run. "I'm good, thanks," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Bus will be here soon." He chuckled softly, like I'd just said something funny. "You sure? You don't look like you're in any hurry to get home." My grip tightened around my phone. He was testing me, pushing, seeing how much I'd resist before he took things further. "Really? I'm fine," I said, glancing down the street, hoping, praying for headlights, for another person, for anything that would break this moment. The SUV didn't move. Neither did he. "You don't want to be out here alone," he murmured, leaning slightly closer to the open window. "It's a dangerous world, you know?" The way he said it, slow, deliberate, made my blood run cold. My heart was hammering against my ribs now, my breath shallow. Then he did something I hadn't expected. He opened his door. A jolt of pure panic shot through me as he stepped out, his movements slow, controlled, like he had all the time in the world. He was taller than I expected, broad shoulders hidden beneath that dark jacket. I took a step back. "Come on," he said, voice still eerily calm. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." I didn't think. I didn't plan. I ran. I bolted down the sidewalk, feet pounding against the concrete, my breath coming against the concrete, my breath coming against the concrete. I ran. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps, the way they didn't sound rushed, like he wasn't chasing me, like he already knew I had nowhere to go. But I wasn't going to find out. I rounded the corner and spotted a gas station up ahead, the fluorescent lights like a goddamn beacon in the darkness. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, my legs screaming, but I didn't stop, not until I was inside, not until I slammed through the door, nearly knocking over a shelf of snacks. The clerk, a scrawny teenager with a mop of greasy hair, blinked at me, confused. "You okay?" I didn't answer. I just turned, breathless, staring out the glass doors, watching, waiting. The SUV was gone, just like that. I stood there, hands shaking, heart still hammering against my ribs. I didn't leave that gas station for almost an hour. When I finally did, I walked home, sticking to the main roads, well-lit areas, never letting my phone leave my hand. I never saw the man again. I never saw the SUV again, but that night has never left me, and I never wait at a bus stop alone anymore. I still think about that night at the bus stop. The way that man watched me, the way his voice coiled around my nerves like something sharp, something meant to cut. I don't wait for buses alone anymore. I don't even take the bus if I can help it. You never know when you're going to be the wrong person, in the wrong place, at the wrong time. But that's the thing, isn't it? You never see it coming. You go through life thinking danger is something loud, something obvious, something with a sign flashing above its head that says, "Stay away." But it's not. It's quiet, it's subtle, it's the knock at your car window in the middle of the night. That's what Olivia learned. She had just pulled into a quiet residential street in Denver, waiting for her friend to come downstairs. It was one of those neighborhoods where the houses all looked the same, where the only movement at this hour was the occasional flicker of a TV behind a curtained window. Midnight had come and gone, and she was sitting in the driver's seat of her old Toyota, scrolling through her phone, the soft blue glow reflecting off the windshield. The streetlight above her was dim, buzzing faintly, casting more shadow than light. She didn't hear him approach. That was the first thing that still bothered her later. The knock wasn't a polite tap. It was sharp, hard, deliberate. Her breath hitched as she looked up. A man stood just outside her window, a tall figure wrapped in a dirty gray hoodie, his face shadowed, unreadable. For a second, she thought maybe it was someone who lived nearby, maybe just someone asking for directions. But then she met his eyes, or tried to. There was something wrong with the way he looked at her. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't speaking, he was just staring, his face half done beneath the hood, his posture too still, too calculated. A spike of unease crawled up her spine, but she forced herself to stay calm. She reached for the door lock, pressing it down with a soft click. The man tilted his head slightly, as if he had heard it, as if he had been waiting for it. "Open the door." His voice was low, rasping, like he hadn't spoken in a long time. Olivia shook her head, offering a tight, nervous smile. "Sorry, I can't help you." A long silence stretched between them. She could hear her own heartbeat, feel the way her fingers tightened around her phone. Then, slowly, he lifted his hand, and she saw the brick. He tapped it against the glass, not hard enough to break it, not yet, just enough to make a point. Her stomach flipped. The man took a step closer. "Open the door." Her pulse pounded in her ears. Every part of her was screaming to just drive, but her brain felt disconnected from her body, like she was moving in slow motion. She reached for her keys. He saw. His grip on the brick tightened. "Don't," he whispered. A bolt of panic surged through her, snapping her back to reality. She lunged for the ignition, her hands fumbling in her panic, the engine stalling for half a second too long. The brick hit the glass hard. The window shuddered, tiny cracks spider-webbing across the surface. She screamed. The engine roared to life and she slammed the car into reverse, her tires screeching against the pavement. The man took a step back, his face twisted in something like rage, but something else too, something worse. He wasn't afraid. He had been so sure she wouldn't leave. As she sped down the street, she forced herself to look in the rearview mirror. He was still standing there in the exact same spot, just watching her go. She didn't stop driving until she reached the main road. Didn't let herself breathe until she was in a well-lit gas station, her hands shaking too much to hold her phone. When she finally told her friend what had happened, she tried to laugh it off, to pretend it was nothing. But she never parked in the dark again, and she never forgot the way that man looked at her, like she was nothing more than a door that had almost been unlocked. I don't park in dark, empty streets anymore. Not after what happened to Olivia. It makes you think. How many times have you been alone in your car, scrolling through your phone, oblivious to the world around you? How many times has someone watched you and waited for the moment you weren't paying attention? Olivia was lucky. She got away. But not everyone does. Some people don't realize they're in danger until it's too late, until the quiet unease in their gut turns into the cold certainty that something is very, very wrong. That's what David felt that night in Seattle. He had always enjoyed his late-night walks, the kind where the world felt empty, the air crisp against his skin, and the silence stretched out like a warm blanket. It was his way of unwinding, clearing his head after hours of writing. The city at night had a different energy, a stillness that was both comforting and a little eerie if you let your mind wander too far into the what-ifs. But David wasn't the paranoid type. He wasn't the kind of person who looked over his shoulder every few minutes or imagined footsteps in the dark. He knew these streets, and they had always been safe. At least, that's what he thought. That night was colder than usual, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones rather than just brushing against your skin. The park near his apartment wasn't much, just a small, open space with a few walking trails, a couple of benches, and an old playground that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 90s. During the day, it was filled with joggers, parents pushing strollers, and kids chasing each other around the swings. But at night, it was different. It wasn't exactly dangerous. Seattle wasn't that kind of city, but it was empty. Too empty. David didn't think twice before heading down the paved path, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets, his breath curling in the air. He had taken this walk 100 times before, and tonight wasn't any different. Or at least, it shouldn't have been. The first time he heard the footsteps, they were faint, distant. At first, he thought nothing of it. Maybe another late-night walker, maybe someone heading home. And he glanced over his shoulder, expecting to see someone walking behind him, but the path was empty. The only movement came from the wind shifting the leaves. He shook off the slight unease creeping up his spine and kept moving. The footsteps came again. This time they were closer. David stopped. The sound stopped. A chill slithered down his back. He turned again, slower this time, scanning the dimly lit path, the benches, the darkened spaces between the trees. Nothing. No one. The playground stood still in the distance, its empty swings swaying slightly in the breeze. His fingers twitched inside his jacket pocket, brushing against his phone. Maybe he was imagining it. Maybe the wind was playing tricks on him. But then he took another step, and the footsteps followed. David's stomach tightened. He wasn't alone. His mind ran through a dozen rational explanations. Maybe a jogger who had paused somewhere behind him. Maybe someone walking their dog. But there was no dog. No sound other than his own breath and the eerie crunch of gravel beneath his feet. He picked up his pace, moving toward the main road, trying to shake the growing tension in his chest. The footsteps quickened. He stopped again. They stopped too. His heart pounded against his ribs. His breathing was shallow now, uneven. Slowly, he turned his head, forcing himself to look over his shoulder, forcing himself to confirm what his instincts were already screaming. That's when he saw it. A figure just beyond the reach of the nearest streetlight, standing between the trees, not moving, just watching. He couldn't make out any details, just the shape of a person standing in the shadows, half hidden behind the thick trunk of an oak tree. He felt an overwhelming urge to run, but something held him in place, something primal, something ancient. The understanding that prey shouldn't run unless it has no other choice. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, silent, waiting. David swallowed hard. His mouth was dry, his pulse hammering so loudly he could barely hear the wind anymore. He took a step back, testing. The figure took a step forward. David's stomach dropped. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to move, to get out of there. He turned sharply, forcing his legs to cooperate, forcing himself to run. The moment he bolted, the sound behind him exploded. Footsteps. Fast, heavy. Chasing him, David ran harder than he ever had before. His breath burned in his chest, his muscles screamed. But he didn't dare look back. The main road wasn't far. Just past the playground, past the old benches, past the towering trees that now felt like walls closing in on him. He could hear the footsteps gaining, closing the distance between them. Too fast, too close. His foot caught on a crack in the pavement, and for one horrifying second he felt himself pitch forward. His balance wavered, his body twisting mid-air, but somehow he caught himself before hitting the ground. He didn't stop. He couldn't. He pushed forward, his vision tunneling as the glow of the streetlights came into view. Almost there, almost safe. The footsteps were right behind him now, less than a few feet away. He could hear breathing. Drag it. Uneven. Just as he reached the sidewalk, the footsteps stopped. David stumbled into the open street, panting, his lungs screaming for air. His vision swam as he turned, needing to see who had been behind him. But the path was empty. The playground, the benches, the towering trees. No one. David's hands shook as he pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling so badly he nearly dropped it. He stared at the darkness, his mind scrambling for answers, for something that made sense. He hadn't imagined it. Someone had been there. Someone had chased him. But now, there was nothing. A light flickered in the distance, a car turning onto the road, its headlights sweeping across the entrance of the park. For a split second, just before the darkness swallowed the path again, David saw something, a shape, a figure standing just beyond the tree line. Not gone, just waiting. David took a step back, then another, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't wait to see if the figure would move again. He turned and walked away, forcing himself not to run, forcing himself to keep his eyes forward. When he got home, he locked the door behind him and stood there in the dark, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. He had never been a paranoid person before. He had never been afraid of the dark, of quiet streets, of empty parks. But that night, something had followed him. Something that never meant to let him go. And he knew deep down that if he had tripped, if he had fallen, he never would have made it home. I don't walk at night anymore, not after what happened to David. The way he described it, the silence, the footsteps, the shadow that never should have been there, it stuck with me. It made me realize how easily someone could slip into the darkness, how effortlessly they could become a part of it, watching, waiting. It made me wonder how many times I had been watched without even knowing. That's the thing about these kinds of stories. They don't end when the night is over. They stay with you. They change the way you move through the world. They make you second-guess every shadow, every quiet moment, every time you think you're alone. And sometimes they make you see danger before it's too late. That's what saved Sophia. It had been a long night. The kind that dragged, each delivery blending into the next until she couldn't remember where she had been or where she was going. She had been working for the app for a few months now, and she had learned to tune out the exhaustion, to push through the mindless repetition of picking up orders and dropping them off. It was easy work for the most part, boring but easy. Until that night. She had just picked up an order from a late-night taco joint, the kind of place that never closes, where the air is thick with the smell of grease and the neon sign buzzes softly against the quiet. The streets were mostly empty, the houses dark, the sidewalks deserted. Houston was like that sometimes. Loud and crowded one moment, silent and still the next. She followed the GPS, her fingers tapping absently against the steering wheel, her phone lighting up with notifications she ignored. It was just another delivery, nothing special. Then she saw him. At first, he was just a figure in the distance, standing on the side of the road. Nothing unusual about that. People walked at night. People waited for rides. But as she got closer, something about him felt off. He was standing too still. His hands were shoved deep into the pockets of his hoodie, his shoulders slightly hunched, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't checking for traffic. He was just standing there, waiting, and then he stepped into the street. Sophia's breath caught in her throat as she slowed the car, her fingers tightening on the wheel. He lifted a hand, waving her down, his other hand still buried in his pocket. For a split second, she considered stopping. Maybe he needed help. Maybe his car had broken down, or he was lost. But something about the way he moved, too deliberate, too sure, made her stomach twist. She cracked the window, just enough to be polite, just enough to make it clear she wasn't stopping completely. He said, his voice casual, too casual. "You got a minute?" Sophia hesitated. "I'm in the middle of a delivery." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, I just need some directions. You know where?" He named a street she didn't recognize, a place that didn't sound familiar. Her gut twisted tighter. "Sorry," she said quickly, shaking her head. "I don't know that area." He took a step closer. "Come on, just real quick," he said, his tone shifting, the forced friendliness slipping into something more insistent. Sophia's heart was hammering now. She reached for the lock, pressing it down with a quiet click. The man's expression changed, his smile faded, and then, before she could react, he placed his hand on her door. A cold rush of panic flooded her system. "Just look it up for me," he said, his voice low now, almost a command. She shook her head. "I have to go." She tried to roll up the window, but his grip on the door tightened. "Come on," he said, his fingers curling against the metal. Sophia's mind was screaming at her to move, to leave, to drive. She threw the car into drive, her tires screeching against the pavement as she tore away from him. In the rearview mirror, she saw him stumble back, his hands still outstretched, his hood slipping slightly to reveal a face twisted in frustration, in something that almost looked like anger. She didn't stop driving. She turned in a spotlight into one of the driveways, the revolving doors still unstopped. Not when the GPS told her she was close, not when she reached the quiet, empty neighborhood where she was supposed to drop off the food. Her pulse was still racing, her breath coming too fast. She pulled into the driveway, gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles ached. And then she saw it. Ed lights a car pulling onto the street, moving slowly, creeping toward her. Sophia's stomach dropped. It was him. The beat-up sedan rolled to a stop across the street, its engine humming softly. He didn't get out. He just sat there, watching. She forced herself to move. She grabbed the bag of food, stepped out of the car, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. She rang the doorbell, willing the customer to open the door, to hurry up to see that something was wrong. No answer. She knocked. Nothing. The car was still there, the headlights still shining, watching. Sophia's heart was hammering so hard she thought she might be sick. She turned, taking a step back toward her car, and that's when she heard it. The car door slamming shut. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned. Too slow, too late, and suddenly he was there, his hand gripping her arm, yanking her toward him. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he muttered, his fingers tightening. Sophia reacted without thinking. She swung her keys, the sharp metal slicing across his skin. He let out a grunt of pain, loosening his grip just enough for her to jerk away. She didn't hesitate. She ran. Her feet pounded against the pavement as she bolted toward the nearest house, any house, her breath ragged, her lungs burning. She didn't know if he was behind her, didn't dare look. She reached a door and banged on it, screaming, her fists slamming against the wood. A porch light flicked on. A woman, a tired, confused-looking woman in her 60s, opened the door. Sophia shoved past her, gasping, "Call the police!" The woman did. By the time they arrived, the man was gone. His car. Gone like he had never been there at all. But he had been. And if she hadn't fought back, if she had hesitated just a second longer, she wouldn't have been there either. Sophia quit delivering food after that. Some jobs just aren't worth the risk. I don't do food deliveries anymore, not after what happened to Sophia. The way she described it, The feeling of being watched, the creeping realization that the man was waiting for her to step out of the car, the way he grabbed her arm like he had done it before, it was enough to make me rethink how easy it is to fall into someone's trap. They don't always come at you with a knife. They don't always break down your door. Sometimes, they wait. They let you make the mistake. They let you come to them. That's what Daniel learned that night in the parking garage. Daniel had worked the night shift at the hospital for nearly 6 years, and he thought he had seen the worst of people. Blood-soaked ER patients, overdoses, drunks barely clinging to life. But the thing about working late nights is that it messes with your brain. You start feeling like the world is divided in two, the people who live by the daylight and the ones who exist only in the shadows. And when you leave work at 1 in the morning, stepping out into the empty city, you realize just how few people belong to that second world. That night, Daniel was exhausted. He had stayed longer than planned, covering for a coworker, and by the time he stepped out into the hospital's dimly lit parking garage, the place was nearly deserted. His footsteps echoed as he walked across the concrete, the sound bouncing between the thick support beams. The few remaining cars were scattered throughout the lower levels, most of the other employees already home. He reached into his pocket, fumbling for his keys, his brain still half dazed from the 12-hour shift. He wasn't really paying attention, not at first. But as he turned down the last row toward his car, he saw something that made his steps falter. Leaning against one of the pillars, at first Daniel thought nothing of it. Plenty of people used the hospital garage, maybe a visiting family member, maybe a doctor finishing a late shift. But then he realized the man wasn't doing anything. He wasn't checking his phone. He wasn't heading toward a car. He was just standing there. And he was watching. Daniel's pulse kicked up. He kept walking, forcing himself to act normal, forcing himself not to react. He glanced at the man again, trying to get a better look, but the shadows kept his features obscured. All he could make out was a dark hoodie, hands shoved into the pockets, a posture that was too still, too deliberate. Daniel reached his car. He clicked the key fob, the chirp of the locks echoed through the empty garage. He pulled the driver's side door open, but before he could step inside, he heard it. Footsteps. Soft. Measured. Getting closer. Daniel's grip on the door tightened. He turned slightly, just enough to see the man was walking toward him. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to get in the car, to lock the doors, to get the hell out of there. But his hands weren't working right. His fingers were stiff, numb with panic. The man kept coming, 20 feet away, 15, 10. Daniel forced himself to move. He slid into the driver's seat, his hands shaking as he grabbed the door, ready to slam it shut. But the man stopped. Just a few feet from the car, Daniel's breath hitched. A man just stood there, staring. His face was still mostly hidden beneath the hood, but Daniel could feel his eyes on him, locked onto his every movement. His chest was rising and falling in slow, steady breaths, like he was in no hurry. Daniel's hands shook as he reached for the ignition. The man took a step closer. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. Another step. Daniel turned the key. The engine roared to life. For a split second, neither of them moved. Then the man's head tilted slightly, and he grinned, a slow, deliberate grin, like he knew something Daniel didn't, like he had already planned for this. Daniel couldn't breathe. And then, headlights flooded the garage. A car turned the corner, its bright beams slicing through the shadows. The man's expression dropped in an instant. He turned his head like a predator hearing an approaching threat, his body suddenly rigid. And then he stepped back. One step, then another. And then, as the other car drove past, he turned sharply and walked away, disappearing between the rows of parked cars, slipping back into the darkness as if he had never been there at all. Daniel sat there, his hands still gripping the wheel, his body locked in place, his breath ragged. The moment felt too long, too unreal. It wasn't until the other car pulled into a spot on the far end of the garage, its driver completely unaware of what had just happened, that Daniel's brain snapped back into place. He threw the car into reverse. His tires screeched as he backed out of the space. He didn't look toward the shadows. He didn't check to see if the man was still there. He just drove. By the time he reached the street, his hands were still shaking so badly he could barely hold the wheel. His breath came in short, uneven bursts, his pulse refusing to slow. He never saw the man again, ever saw that grin again, but he knew. That man hadn't been there by accident. He had been waiting. And if that other car hadn't shown up when it did, Daniel didn't let himself finish the thought. He quit the night shift 2 weeks later. He never set foot in that parking garage again. I don't park in garages anymore, not after what happened to Daniel. The way he described it, the slow, deliberate footsteps, the way the man's grin never wavered, like he knew he was in control, like he knew he had all the time in the world, it made me think about all the places we assume we're safe, about all the places we take for granted. We close our car doors, we lock our apartments, we tell ourselves that 4 walls and a deadbolt are enough. But what if they aren't? What if the danger is already inside? That's what Megan found out. She had just gotten home from work, exhausted. It was one of those long days where time seemed to blur, where the hours stretched endlessly and every part of her body ached. The Chicago air was bitter that night, sharp against her skin as she stepped into her apartment, the familiar warmth wrapping around her like a security blanket. She locked the door behind her, flicked on the lights, and kicked off her shoes, exhaling deeply. Another long shift, another night of too much caffeine and not enough sleep. All she wanted was to collapse into bed, scroll through her phone for a while, and let the stress drain from her body. She moved through the apartment, turning on the TV for background noise, heading to the kitchen to pour herself a glass of water. The apartment was quiet, as it always was. No roommates, no pets, just her. She liked it that way, loved the solitude, the control. It was a small space, just a bedroom, bathroom, and an open living area, but it was hers. She didn't hear anything at first, not when she settled onto her bed, phone in hand, eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. Not when she mindlessly scrolled, the glow of the screen reflecting off the walls, the sounds of some late-night talk show murmuring in the background. But then, a creak, soft, barely noticeable, like the sound of an old floorboard settling. Megan's eyes flicked up from her phone, paused, listened. Silence. She swallowed, forcing herself to exhale slowly. Old buildings made noise. That was normal. The pipes, the heating system, maybe even the wind outside. She'd lived here long enough to know the sounds of the place. But then it came again, a slow, deliberate creak. Her grip on the phone tightened. This time she didn't move. She just listened, her heart beginning to thud a little too fast. It was coming from the bedroom. No, from inside the bedroom. She sat up slowly, the mattress shifting beneath her. The closet was across from her bed, half discerned in the dim light from the bedside lamp. The door was slightly ajar. Not much. Just an inch, maybe 2. Enough that she could see the dark sliver of space inside. A cold shiver crawled down her spine. Had she left it open? No, she was sure she hadn't. She always closed it completely before bed. Breath felt too loud in the quiet. She stared at the closet, unmoving. The apartment was locked. She had locked it herself. No windows were open. No one had come in. There was no way anyone could be inside. A prickling, cold fear spread through her chest, her limbs suddenly stiff, her throat dry. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to run, to move, but she couldn't. She was frozen, staring at that tiny sliver of darkness, at the space that should be empty but wasn't. Then, a whisper so soft, so close. "Don't turn on the light." Megan screamed. She didn't think, didn't hesitate. She bolted from the bed, heart hammering. Feet barely touching the floor as she ripped open the bedroom door and sprinted into the hall. Her mind was racing, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she grabbed the front door handle, fumbling with the lock, fingers shaking violently. Behind her, a sound. A shift. A movement. She didn't look back. She wrenched open the door, stumbled into the hallway, and slammed it shut behind her, her body colliding with the opposite wall as she gasped for air. Her neighbor's door was just a few feet away. She forced herself forward, banging on it so hard her knuckles stung. It took seconds. Endless seconds. Then, the door opened. A middle-aged woman, groggy, confused. Megan shoved past her before she could even speak, nearly tripping over herself as she gasped, "Someone's in my apartment. Call the police. Now." The woman's eyes widened, but she didn't hesitate. She grabbed her phone, dialing 911 as Megan stood there, shaking, her entire body still locked in that awful, paralyzing fear. The minutes stretched on like hours. When the police arrived, Megan stood in the hallway as they unlocked her apartment, weapons drawn. They searched everything, checked every inch, and found nothing. The closet was open, but it was empty. No signs of forced entry, no signs that anyone had been inside at all, except the attic hatch above the closet was slightly ajar, and the dust around it had been disturbed. Megan didn't go back inside. She stayed with her neighbor that night, her mind racing with all the horrible possibilities. Had they been hiding there all along, watching her for days, weeks? Had she locked herself in with them every single night without realizing? She moved out the next morning. Didn't even pack most of her things. She didn't care. Because the worst part, the part that still kept her up at night, even in a new city, a new apartment, surrounded by new locks, new doors, new walls, wasn't the whisper. It was the fact that whoever had been inside her closet never tried to stop her from leaving. They let her go. Like they knew it wasn't time yet. Like they knew one day she'd be alone again. And maybe next time, she wouldn't notice the door was open. If there's one thing these stories have in common, it's that danger isn't always obvious. It doesn't always come crashing through your front door or announce itself with a scream. Sometimes it waits in the shadows. Sometimes it's disguised as something harmless. A friendly stranger, a routine drive home, a quiet night in your own apartment. The scariest thing about these stories isn't what happened, it's what almost happened. And that's what I want you to take away from them. Trust your instincts. Every single person in these stories had a moment, a split second, where they knew something wasn't right. They felt it in their gut, that small, nagging voice that told them to run, to lock the door, to look over their shoulder, and that's what saved them. So many people ignore that feeling. They tell themselves they're overreacting, that they're being paranoid. But listen, paranoia doesn't kill you. Ignoring your instincts does. Be aware of your surroundings. It's easy to get comfortable, to assume that nothing bad will ever happen to you. But the truth is, it only takes one moment of distraction, one lapse in judgment for something terrible to happen. Keep your head up. Pay attention to the people around you. Notice if someone is following you, if a car has passed by too many times, if someone is watching you just a little too long. Those little details could be the difference between getting home safe and becoming a story like this. Never assume safety. Just because a place is familiar doesn't mean it's safe. Megan had lived in her apartment for months before realizing she wasn't alone. Daniel had parked in that same garage every night before he finally saw the man waiting for him. We like to believe that danger only exists in dark alleys and abandoned buildings, but the truth is, it can exist anywhere, even in your own home. Always lock your doors. Check your surroundings before getting in your car. Don't let your guard down just because you think you're in a safe place. Most importantly, act fast. Every person in these stories had a choice: stay and see what happens, or run. And the ones who ran are the ones telling their stories. If something doesn't feel right, don't hesitate. Get in your car and drive. Cross the street. Call for help. Don't worry about looking rude or overreacting. Your safety is worth more than a stranger's feelings. At the end of the day, these stories aren't just meant to scare you. They're meant to remind you that the world isn't always as safe as we like to think it is. But that doesn't mean you have to live in fear. It just means you have to be smart, be careful, be aware, be ready. Because the best way to survive the unknown is to never let it catch you off guard. If you've made it this far, I want to thank you. Your support means everything, and sharing these stories with you is what keeps this channel going. If you've ever had a chilling experience of your own, something that still makes your skin crawl when you think about it, feel free to share it in the comments. Who knows, maybe your story will be the next one we tell. Until then, stay safe, trust your instincts, and remember, sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you see, it's what you don't.